I stood at the podium, hands steady on the microphone, looking out at 500 faces waiting for the valedictorian speech. My parents weren't among them. They didn't know this day existed. They didn't know I existed. Not really. Not the version of me standing here now wearing honours cords that represented years they'd never witnessed. The auditorium fell silent. I smiled, calm and unshaken, because this moment wasn't for them. It never had been. I was 6 years old on my first day of school. I remember standing by the front door in my new uniform, a pressed white shirt, navy skirt, shoes polished until they gleamed. I'd woken up early, laid out everything myself, practiced tying my shoes 4 times to make sure the loops were even. My backpack hung from both shoulders, heavy with new notebooks, and the pencil case Mum had tossed onto my bed without looking up from her phone. "Mum?" I called into the kitchen. "It's time." She didn't turn around. She was making breakfast for my brother, Damien. Scrambled eggs with cheese, the kind she knew he liked. He was 3 years older, already in 4th grade, already the centre of every conversation, every plan, every photograph on the wall. "Dad?" I tried next, peeking into the living room where he sat with his laptop balanced on his knees, typing furiously. "Helena, not now," he muttered. "I have a presentation." "But school starts in 20 minutes. Take the bus." I didn't know which bus. I didn't know the route. This was my first day, and we'd never discussed it. I thought parents took their children on the first day. I'd seen it in books, on television, mothers holding hands, fathers taking pictures, families smiling. I waited by the door for 10 more minutes, hoping someone would remember. Damien came down the stairs. Mom handed him his lunch bag, packed with his favourite snacks, a note tucked inside with a smiley face. I could see it peeking out from the top. "Ready, sweetie?" Mom said to him, grabbing her keys. My heart jumped. She was coming. She'd drive us both. They walked past me, literally stepped around me as if I were furniture. Mum opened the door, Damien walked through, and she followed. The door closed. The lock clicked. I stood there in the empty hallway, 6 years old, uniform perfect, backpack ready, and completely invisible. I figured out the bus route by asking a neighbour. Mrs. Hoffman, an elderly woman who'd lived on our street forever, looked at me with confusion when I appeared on her doorstep alone. "Shouldn't your mother be taking you?" she asked. "She had to take Damien," I lied, already learning to cover for them. "Can you tell me which bus goes to Riverside Elementary?" She did more than that. She walked me to the bus stop, waited with me, told the driver to make sure I got off at the right location. I remember her hand on my shoulder, warm, steady, the most maternal touch I'd received that morning. When the bus pulled away, I watched her, through the window, standing on the corner, waving. She looked worried. I arrived at school 15 minutes late. The classroom was already in session, and Mrs. Peterson paused mid-sentence when I opened the door. The other children had name tags on their desks, had already shared facts about themselves, had already begun the ritual of first day bonding. "You must be Helena," she said kindly. "We're so glad you're here." She didn't ask where my parents were, didn't question why I'd come alone. She simply guided me to my seat, handed me a name tag, and continued with her lesson. But I saw her write something in a small notebook on her desk. Later, I'd learned she'd marked my file with a single word: monitor. That night at dinner, Mum asked Damien about his day for 40 minutes. She wanted every detail: what he ate at lunch, who he sat with, what his teacher looked like, whether he'd made any new friends. Dad listened, laughed, asked follow-up questions. They dissected his experience like archaeologists examining precious artifacts. I sat 3 feet away, fork moving food around my plate, waiting. They never turned to me. Not once. When dessert came, ice cream sundaes that Mum had prepared specially for Damien's successful first day, I finally spoke. "I went to school today too." Mum blinked, as if surprised I was there. "Oh, right. How was it?" "Good." "That's nice, honey." She turned back to Damien. "So you were saying about recess?" I finished my dinner in silence, washed my own plate, and went to my room. Through the thin walls, I could hear them laughing downstairs, could hear Damien's animated voice recounting some playground adventure. I sat on my bed, still in my school clothes, and something inside me shifted. Not broke, that would come later in smaller increments, but shifted, like a door closing on a room I'd never be invited into. I was 6 years old, and I'd just learned the most important lesson of my life. I was on my own. It wasn't abuse. They fed me, clothed me, kept a roof over my head. The house was warm. My bedroom had furniture. There were groceries in the kitchen. By all objective measures, I was cared for. But there's a difference between being kept and being loved, between being maintained and being seen. Over the next few weeks, the pattern became clearer. Birthday parties for Damien with themes and guest lists and elaborate cakes. Nothing for me, my 7th birthday passed without acknowledgement, until I reminded them 3 days later. Mum's face had flushed with embarrassment. She'd taken me to the store, let me pick out a toy from the clearance aisle, bought a grocery store cupcake with generic frosting. "Don't tell your father I forgot," she'd said. I didn't. I was already learning that their comfort mattered more than my disappointment. School events were the same. Parent-teacher conferences where they showed up for Damien, discussed his progress with intense focus, scheduled follow-up, meetings. Mine they missed entirely or attended with visible impatience, checking their phones, leaving early. When I won the 2nd grade spelling bee, Mum was in the audience for Damien's class presentation that happened to be the same afternoon. She sat in the back, never knew I was on stage 3 rooms away, holding a certificate I'd eventually throw in the trash. Christmas was when the inequality became impossible to ignore. Damien's gifts had to fill half the living room. Video games, argan, sports equipment, expensive electronics, toys he'd asked for and received without question. Mine were practical, a winter coat because I'd outgrown the old one, socks, underwear. Once, a dictionary that Dad thought would help with school. These items weren't wrapped in festive paper. They came in store bags, handed to me almost as an afterthought. We focused more on Damien this year, because he's older and notices more, Mum explained when she saw my face. "You understand, right?" I nodded. I was 8. What choice did I have? But I understood something else too. I would never be the priority. No matter what I achieved, no matter how good I was, no matter how little I asked for, I would always be secondary. The math was simple. They had enough love and attention for one child. They'd chosen him before I was born, and my arrival had been an unwelcome disruption to their perfect equation. I stopped expecting. I stopped asking. I stopped trying to be seen. Instead, I watched. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to discover, was that I remembered everything. Every slight, every dismissal, every moment they chose Damien over me. I catalogued them, not out of bitterness, but out of survival. I needed to understand the system I was living in. I needed to map the territory of my invisibility so I could navigate it without constantly crashing into the walls of their indifference. I kept a journal starting in 3rd grade. Not a diary full of feelings. I'd learned early that feelings were indulgent, unhelpful. Instead, I documented facts. Mum forgot to pick me up from school, waited 90 minutes, walked home. She was at Damien's baseball game. Dad promised to help with science project. Didn't come home until 10 p.m. Project due tomorrow. Did it myself. Birthday, age 9. They remembered on day 3. Damien got party with 15 friends. The journal wasn't for processing emotions. It was evidence. Proof that I wasn't imagining the neglect, that the pattern was real and consistent. On days when I questioned myself, maybe I was too sensitive, maybe I was making it up, maybe I was the problem, I'd read back through months of entries and see the undeniable truth. I wasn't the problem. I was just unwanted. Mum confirmed it when I was 10. I wasn't supposed to hear the conversation. She was on the phone with her sister, Aunt Leslie, speaking in the low tones adults use when they think children aren't listening. I'd come downstairs for water and froze in the hallway when I heard my name. "It's just different with Helena," Mum was saying. "I don't know how to explain it. With Damien, everything felt natural. I wanted to be around him. With her, it feels like work, like I'm forcing myself to care." "That's normal," Aunt Leslie said through the speaker. "Not every parent bonds the same way with every child." "It's more than that. When I found out I was pregnant with her, I didn't want... we talked about other options. But Robert's family is Catholic, and his mother would have... Well, so here we are. And I try, Leslie. I really do. But when I look at her, I just feel tired." I set the glass down silently, walked back upstairs, lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Other options. She'd considered getting rid of me, and the only reason she hadn't was because of what other people would think. I existed because of appearances, because keeping me was easier than dealing with judgment. I didn't cry. Even at 10, I understood that tears were useless. Instead, I made a decision. If I was going to exist despite being unwanted, I would exist on my own terms. I would build a life they couldn't touch, couldn't claim, couldn't ruin with their indifference. I would become someone they couldn't ignore. And then I'd make sure they never got to take credit for it. So I stopped performing for them. I performed for myself. In 2nd grade, when Mum forgot to sign my permission slip for the science museum trip, I forged her signature. I'd practiced her handwriting for weeks, studying the swooping K in Keller, the way she dotted her I's with little circles. The teacher never questioned it. I went on the trip, learned about planets and tectonic plates, bought a small telescope from the gift shop, with coins I'd saved from lunch money I didn't spend. That telescope became my first real possession, something I'd chosen, something I'd bought myself, something that was mine alone. In 4th grade, when Dad missed my parent-teacher conference because he was at Damien's soccer game, I went alone. The school secretary had looked uncomfortable when I'd walked in by myself. "Where are your parents, honey?" They couldn't make it, but Miss Peterson said I could come listen. It wasn't technically a lie. Mrs. Peterson had said that once, months ago, in a different context. The secretary made a phone call, spoke in hushed tones, but ultimately let me sit in the tiny chair across from my teacher. Mrs. Peterson had looked sad when she realised I was alone. She went through my progress report anyway, speaking to the empty chair beside me for the first few minutes before adjusting. She started directing her comments to me instead. "You're reading at an 8th grade level, Helena. That's exceptional for a 4th grader. Have you thought about the Young Scholars program?" "What's that?" "It's for advanced students. Extra classes, field trips, college preparatory work. I think you'd thrive there. Would it cost money?" "There's a fee, but there are scholarships available. Could you help me apply? Without needing my parents?" She'd understood immediately. Her face had softened with something like pity, which I hated, but also determination. "Yes, I can help you with that." She did. She became the first adult who actively chose to see me, to invest in me, to go out of her way. The scholarship application required teacher recommendations, student essays, and a parent's signature. Miss Peterson handled the first 2, and I forged the 3rd. By 5th grade, I was in the Young Scholars program, attending Saturday sessions, going on educational trips, learning alongside students who were also hungry for something more. My parents never knew. They never asked where I went on Saturdays. They assumed I was at the library, which I'd been going to since I was 7. They'd long stopped tracking my movements, as long as I was home by dinner and stayed quiet. By middle school, I was fluent in invisibility. I moved through the house like a ghost, leaving no trace, requiring nothing. I made my own meals, did my own laundry, forged signatures on report cards that no one asked to see. My grades were perfect. Straight A's in every subject. advanced placement classes as academic achievement awards. They never knew. The certificates and honours came in the mail, and I'd intercept them, filing them away in a box under my bed. A box that grew heavier each year with evidence of a life they were completely unaware of. Damien's B- in algebra got a tutor and 2 months of concerned conversations. My straight A's got filed away in a folder they never opened. The differential treatment wasn't even subtle anymore. Damien got a new laptop for his 13th birthday. I got a gift card to a bookstore for $25. When his laptop broke a year later, they bought him another immediately. When my 5-year-old hand-me-down phone finally died, Mum told me I'd have to save up for a new one myself. "You're old enough to be responsible for your own things," she'd said. I was 12, Damien was 15, and had never been responsible for anything. But I didn't argue. I took a babysitting job for the neighbours. Then another family. Then another. By 13, I had a steady rotation of babysitting gigs that paid for my phone, my clothes, the books I wanted, the supplies I needed for school. The money gave me something more valuable than things. It gave me proof that I could take care of myself. I didn't hate them. Hate requires attention, and I was done giving them mine. Hate would mean I still cared about their approval, still wanted their love. But I'd moved past wanting. I'd entered a phase of clinical observation. I studied them instead. I watched how Dad manipulated conversations to always centre his needs, how he'd derail any topic that didn't interest him, how he'd weaponize his moods to control the household. If he was stressed about work, everyone had to tiptoe around him. If he was happy, he'd be generous with Damien, but barely notice me. He was a narcissist in the truest clinical sense. I'd know, because I'd read the psychology textbooks. Mum was an enabler. She'd rewrite history to justify her choices, convince herself that her indifference toward me was somehow my fault. I was independent and didn't need as much attention. I was mature for my age and handled things on my own. She'd created a narrative where neglecting me was actually respecting my autonomy. Damien, to his credit, seemed genuinely oblivious for years. He'd been raised as the sun in our family's solar system, and he'd never thought to question why everything orbited him. He wasn't malicious. He was simply the product of their creation. A boy taught that his needs came first, his feelings mattered most, his future deserved all the investment. They were a unit, a closed circle, and I was the observer taking notes from the outside. And while they ignored me, I built something they couldn't see. 8th grade was the year I stopped reacting. Damien had just started high school, and the entire household revolved around his adjustment. Mum drove him every morning, even though the school was walkable. She'd wake up early to make him breakfast, pack him elaborate lunches, quiz him on his homework. Dad attended every football practice. Even though Damien spent most of the time on the bench, they talked about his future constantly. Colleges, scholarships, career possibilities, mapping out his life with the kind of attention and care I'd never received for a single day. I sat at the same dinner table, invisible, listening to them discuss Damien's potential like he was a stock they'd invested in. I stopped trying to join conversations, stopped waiting to be asked about my day, stopped hoping they'd notice the certificate I'd won for the regional writing competition. First place, beating out 300 other students, a 500 prize. I folded it carefully and put it in my box under the bed, along with every other piece of evidence that I existed beyond their peripheral vision. The money I deposited into my secret bank account. Yes, I had a bank account they didn't know about. I'd opened it at 13, using a combination of forged documents and the help of a sympathetic bank teller who'd asked too many questions about my parents' absence and decided to look the other way. The account existed under my name and Mum's, technically, but all statements came to a PO box I'd rented. By 8th grade, I had $3,000 saved. By 9th grade, it would be $7,000. Instead of seeking their attention, I focused inward. I started reading psychology books, understanding manipulation, family dynamics, narcissistic systems. I studied business strategy, financial independence, long-term planning. I was 13 years old reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad and The Millionaire Next Door and taking notes on compound interest and retirement accounts. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, had noticed my reading habits and started recommending books. "Are you doing a project?" she'd asked. "Yes," I'd said, which wasn't entirely a lie. The project was my life. She didn't press further, but she started leaving books for me at the front desk: personal finance, real estate investment, college planning guides. She became another adult who saw me, who quietly supported my invisible preparation for a future I was designing alone. I got my first official job at 14, tutoring younger students in math and English. I charged $15 an hour, which was below market rate, but enough to build my savings quickly. I was good at it, patient, clear, able to explain complex concepts simply. Within months, I had a waiting list of students. Parents would drop their kids at the library, pay me in cash, and leave glowing reviews that brought more clients. The money wasn't much by adult standards, but to a 14-year-old with no expenses, it was wealth. I saved every dollar in my secret account, watching the balance grow like a garden I was cultivating in the dark. This was my escape fund, my independence fund, the foundation of a life I was building brick by brick, while my family remained completely unaware. I taught myself to cook properly, not just ramen and sandwiches, but real meals. I'd watch YouTube videos on my cheap phone, practice techniques, learn to make dishes from scratch. It started as a necessity. I was tired of eating whatever leftovers remained after family meals, but became something I enjoyed. Cooking was methodical, logical, follow the steps, get the result. Unlike family relationships, recipes were reliable. I learned to budget obsessively. Every dollar I earned got allocated, 70% to savings, 20% to necessities, 10% to investing in myself. Books, online courses, tools for learning. I took free online courses in coding, graphic design, accounting. I taught myself Python and HTML. I learnt Photoshop and Illustrator. Every skill I acquired was a brick in the foundation of a life I was building in secret, a future where I wouldn't need anyone who didn't choose to see me. By 15, I'd stopped speaking unless spoken to. It wasn't defiance, it was strategy. I'd read about grey rock technique, making yourself so boring and unremarkable that you're not worth paying attention to. It was meant for dealing with narcissists, and I applied it religiously at home. I answered questions with brief, uninteresting responses. How was school? Fine. What did you do today? Nothing much. I never offered information, never initiated conversations, never created opportunities for them to pretend they cared. The less space I took up, the less they noticed what I was doing. I became so unremarkable, so easy to overlook, that I could disappear for hours, entire Saturdays spent at the library or walking through the city, and return without a single question. Where were you? Library? All day? Yes. They'd nod and go back to whatever they were doing. They never asked what I studied, what I read, who I saw. I could have been doing anything. They didn't care enough to wonder. I was training myself for independence, and they were training me to survive without them. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to avoid the burden of parenting me, they'd accidentally created the most self-sufficient teenager in our entire town. I could cook, clean, budget, earn money, forge documents, navigate bureaucracy, manage my education, and plan my future, all without any help. I was a machine of efficiency, powered by necessity and polished by neglect. But there was a cost. I had no close friends. The Young Scholars program had ended after 8th grade, and I'd never maintained those relationships. Making friends required time, energy, vulnerability, resources I didn't have. Every friendship came with implicit expectations, hanging out at each other's houses, meeting parents, attending family dinners. I couldn't do any of that. How would I explain that my parents wouldn't remember my friends' names, that they wouldn't bother to greet them, that my house was a place where I existed in the margins? So, I stayed alone. It was easier, safer. I was friendly at school, polite, helpful, the girl who'd lend you notes or explain homework, but never close, never vulnerable. I built walls so high that no one thought to try climbing them. By 16, I was completely self-contained, a planet orbiting nothing, generating my own gravity, my own light. And they never noticed I'd left their solar system entirely. The turning point came during junior year. It was college application season, and the house buzzed with excitement about Damien's prospects. He was applying to state schools, safety schools, reaches he had no chance of getting into. His SAT scores were average, 1150 on his first attempt, 1190 on his second after expensive prep courses. His GPA hovered around 3.2, inflated by easy electives and generous teachers. His essay, which Mum and Dad agonised over for weeks, was generic and uninspired. Something about learning teamwork through football, despite spending most games on the bench. But they were invested. They hired a college consultant at $200 an hour. They paid for additional SAT prep courses. They visited campuses in 3 different states, turning each trip into a family vacation that I was neither invited to nor informed about. I found out they'd gone to Boston when I saw the photos on Mum's social media. The 3 of them at Harvard Yard, Damien in a sweatshirt from the campus bookstore. Caption, "So proud of my son exploring his future. College-bound, proud mum." I'd been at home that weekend, working double shifts of tutoring, thinking they were busy with work. They hadn't told me they were leaving town. Meanwhile, I took the SAT alone on a Saturday morning that fall. I'd registered myself, paid the fee with my savings, woken up at 6 a.m. and taken 2 buses to the testing centre. I was nervous, but prepared. I'd studied using free Khan Academy resources and library prep books for 6 months. I scored 1540, 99th percentile. I took it again in December, just to see if I could improve. 1570. I told no one. The scores came to my P.O. box. I stored them with my growing collection of achievements they knew nothing about. I applied to 16 schools, all with application fee waivers I'd researched and obtained myself. The process was complex. Each waiver required proof of financial need, which was ironic given that my family wasn't actually poor. We were solidly middle class, but I qualified based on my personal income. 0 on paper, since all my tutoring was cash. I felt no guilt about the lie. They'd contributed nothing to my education. They'd contribute nothing to my college. The waivers were earned through their neglect. I wrote my essays in the library, in coffee shops, in my bedroom, late at night. I wrote about invisibility, about self-creation, about building yourself when no one's watching. I wrote about being the architect of your own life when no one hands you blueprints. They were raw, honest, vulnerable in ways I never allowed myself to be in person. Mrs. Peterson, who'd stayed in touch through the years, read my essays and cried, "This is extraordinary, Helena. You're extraordinary." "Thank you for seeing me," I'd said, and she'd understood I wasn't just talking about the essays. I requested letters of recommendation from teachers who actually knew my name, who'd watched me excel without fanfare, who understood something was different about the quiet girl who never had parents at school events. They wrote about my independence, my intellectual curiosity, my resilience. One teacher, Mr. Torres, wrote, "Helena is the most self-motivated student I've encountered in 20 years of teaching. She requires no external validation, no parental pressure, no grade incentive beyond her own internal drive for excellence. She is entirely self-created, and that is both inspiring and heartbreaking. I submitted everything without anyone at home knowing I'd even started the process. I applied to Ivy Leagues and top-tier universities: Columbia, Stanford, University of Chicago, Brown, Yale. I applied to schools with full-ride scholarship programs, big state honors colleges that offered complete financial packages to high-achieving students. I applied to places so far away that coming home for holidays would be financially improbable. I was methodical, strategic. This wasn't just about getting into college. It was about escape. In March, the acceptance letters started coming to my P.O. box. Columbia. Full scholarship. Room, board, tuition, books. Stanford. Full ride, plus a stipend for research. University of Chicago. Complete financial package. Brown. Nearly full scholarship. Yale. Waitlisted, but later accepted with full aid, full scholarships to 3 state honors colleges, acceptances from 14 of my 16 applications, most with financial aid packages that covered everything. I sat in the post office, surrounded by thick envelopes, and felt something I'd never experienced before: pride. Not the kind that requires external validation, but the deep, unshakable kind that comes from knowing you built something real. I collected the letters, stored them in my box under the bed, and watched as the family celebrated Damien's acceptance to a mid-tier state school, the only place that had accepted him, with a party, a cake, a Facebook announcement with 100 congratulations. They'd spent $10,000 on his college process. He'd gotten into one school with no scholarship. I'd spent bucks. I'd gotten into 14 schools with full rides from 6. I smiled when appropriate, nodded when Dad talked about how proud he was, said nothing when Mum cried happy tears about her son's bright future. "We did it!" Dad had proclaimed at the celebration dinner. "We got our boy into college!" We. As if Damien's mediocre achievement was somehow their collective triumph. I wondered what pronoun they'd use for me. Probably still we. They'd find a way to claim my success if they knew about it. But they didn't know. And I was going to keep it that way as long as possible. The guidance counsellor called the house in April. Mrs. Anderson, who'd replaced Mrs. Chen. I was at the library, working on a research paper, so I didn't intercept it. Mum answered. Mrs. Anderson was new to the school and didn't know our family dynamic. She didn't know I'd specifically asked her not to contact my parents. She'd decided this was too important to keep quiet. She told my mother that I'd been accepted to Columbia University with a full academic scholarship, that the school was requesting a final confirmation of attendance, that this was an extraordinary achievement, that I'd be the first student from our school to attend an Ivy League in 5 years. She'd meant well. She'd thought she was sharing good news. Instead, she detonated a bomb. I came home to find Mum sitting at the kitchen table, my acceptance letter in her hands. She'd gone into my room, opened my box, found everything. The letters were spread across the table like evidence in an interrogation. Columbia, Stanford, Chicago, Brown, Yale, scholarship offers, honor society certificates, writing awards, math competition prizes, everything I'd hidden for years. "Helena," she said slowly, her voice strange, "what is this?" Dad emerged from his office. Damien came down from his room, probably drawn by the unusual tone. They all stared at me like I was a stranger who'd walked into their house uninvited. I set my backpack down calmly, looked at the table, looked at them. "College acceptances," I said simply. "Columbia?" Dad took the letter from Mum, read it as if the words might rearrange into something different. "You applied to Columbia, and 15 other places. When? Last fall, when everyone else applies." Mum's face shifted through several emotions: confusion, surprise, something that might have been hurt, Then, anger. Why didn't you tell us? I looked at her directly, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years, held her gaze until she started to fidget. Would you have noticed? The silence was profound. I could hear the refrigerator humming, a car passing outside, Damien shifting his weight. Helena, that's not fair, Dad started, his voice taking on the defensive edge he used when challenged. I took the SAT twice, studied for 8 months, wrote 15 essays, requested letters of recommendation from teachers whose names you've never asked. I did all of it at the kitchen table, in the living room, in spaces you walked through every day. You never asked what I was working on, not once. You should have told us, Mum said, but her voice was weak. She knew. I brought home the PSAT information packet, left it on the counter next to your coffee maker. It sat there for 2 weeks before I threw it away. I mentioned college once at dinner last September. Dad told me to wait until Damien's process was finished so we could focus. I waited. He never brought it up again. Dad opened his mouth, closed it. He had no defense because it was true. I applied for 17 different scholarships, won 9 of them. The certificates came in the mail. I picked them up before you saw them. I was Student of the Month 4 times this year. The school sent letters home. I intercepted those too. I got a perfect score on the AP English exam last year. You didn't know I was taking AP classes. Damien shifted uncomfortably. He'd never had to witness his parents' neglect directly. He'd benefited from it, sure, basked in the overflow of their attention, but he'd never had to see it named and presented as fact. Never had to confront what his privilege cost me. We're proud of you, Dad said, the words clearly difficult, forced out like broken glass. Are you? He didn't answer, couldn't answer, because we both knew he wasn't proud. He was shocked, possibly threatened, definitely uncomfortable that I'd achieved something beyond their awareness, beyond their control. I'm going to Columbia, I continued, my voice steady. I've already accepted. I'm leaving in August. I'll be paying for my books and personal expenses with money I've saved from tutoring. The scholarship covers tuition, room, and board. You won't need to contribute anything. You won't need to do anything. I've handled it all. Mum stood up abruptly. Helena, sweetie, we want to be part of this. No, I said quietly. You don't. You want to feel like you were part of it. There's a difference. That's not... You don't know my favourite colour. You don't know what I want to study. You don't know who my closest teacher mentors are. You don't know what I do on Saturdays, or where I go after school, or what matters to me. You don't know me at all. And now that there's something impressive to claim, you want to suddenly be involved? That's not love, Mum. That's image management. She looked like I'd slapped her. Dad's jaw tightened. Damien stared at the floor. Here's what's going to happen, I said, and my voice was calm, clinical, the voice of someone laying out terms. I'm going to Columbia in August. I'm going to succeed there the same way I succeeded here, alone. You will tell people whatever you want about my college acceptance. You'll probably post it on Facebook, take credit, perform your version of Proud Parents. I won't stop you. But I won't participate in the performance. I won't pretend we're a close family. I won't give you photos for your narrative. I'll be polite, I'll be civil, but I'm done pretending you were involved in building me. The silence stretched. Mum's eyes were wet. Dad looked angry, but underneath I saw shame. Damien wouldn't meet my gaze. You created this, I said to my parents. Not maliciously, maybe not even consciously, but you created a daughter who learned to need nothing from you, who learned to build everything alone, who learned that survival meant invisibility. And now you're upset that I actually survived, that I actually built something. You don't get to be hurt by the consequences of your choices. I picked up my letters from the table, carefully, one by one, and put them back in their box. I'll stay out of your way for the next few months, and then I'll be gone. Really, truly gone. Not just physically, but emotionally. And maybe then you'll understand what you lost. Not through anything I did to you, but through everything you didn't do for me. I walked upstairs with my box of achievements, closed my bedroom door, and felt nothing but relief. The confrontation I'd never planned had happened, and I'd said everything I needed to say. They tried, in the months that followed, awkward attempts at connection that felt like strangers learning to speak a new language. Mum started asking about my plans. Where would I live? What classes would I take? Did I need help shopping for dorm supplies? Dad offered to drive me to campus to help set up my room. Damien, to his credit, seemed genuinely impressed and told his friends his sister was going to an Ivy League, though I suspected it was more about reflected glory than actual pride. But their interest felt performative. They wanted to be seen as good parents, now that there was something impressive to claim. They wanted the Facebook announcement, the bragging rights, the reflected glory. I watched them practice their lines. We always knew Helena was special, Mum told Aunt Leslie on the phone. Had they? Had they known anything about me at all? Dad started telling colleagues about my daughter at Columbia, as if he'd been involved, as if he'd driven me to campus tours and helped edit essays and celebrated each milestone. I heard him on a work call once, going on about how proud he was, how hard I'd worked, how excited the family was. The family. As if I'd ever been part of that unit. I didn't give them what they wanted. I kept my preparations private, bought my dorm supplies during solo target trips, using my own money, loading everything into my car. Yes, I'd bought a car, a used Honda with 150,000 miles that I'd purchased with cash from my savings. They'd been shocked when I drove it home one day. I hadn't asked permission. I'd just done it. I packed my belongings in boxes I collected from grocery stores, made my arrangements without input or assistance. When they asked to help, I politely declined. When they pushed, I remained firm. This was mine. They hadn't earned the privilege of participating. The night before I left, Mum tried to have a sentimental conversation. She came to my room, a space she'd entered maybe 5 times in the past 2 years, and sat on my bed with the tentative posture of someone entering foreign territory. I know we weren't always present, she started, her voice soft, apologetic. But you're our daughter. We love you. I looked at her, really studied her face, the face I'd spent 17 years trying to get to see me. Do you know my favourite colour? I asked. She hesitated, searching her memory for information that had never been stored there. Blue? Green. Dark green, like forest moss. Oh. Do you know what I want to study? Business. Neuroscience and creative writing. Double major. That's ambitious. Do you know who my closest friend is? Who I talked to when things were hard? Who saw me when you didn't? She looked pained now, her face crumpling slightly. Sweetheart, Mrs. Peterson, my 4th grade art teacher. She's been mentoring me for 8 years. She wrote one of my recommendation letters. She's coming to my graduation next spring. You'll meet her then, probably, and you'll realise that a woman who taught me for 1 year cared more about my life than you did for 17. Helena, please, you don't love me, Mum. You love the idea of being a mother who loves me. You love the version of me that makes you look good in front of your friends. You love what I've achieved because now you can claim it. But you don't love me. You don't know me. And I've made peace with that. I really have. I just need you to stop pretending otherwise. It's exhausting for both of us. She left crying. Dad never came to say goodbye. Pride, probably, or maybe shame. Damien helped me carry boxes to the car in the early morning darkness. We worked in silence until everything was loaded. "You're kind of a badass," he said finally, hands in his pockets. "Thanks. I'm sorry we sucked. I'm sorry I didn't notice. I should have." "You were a kid too? You just got different programming than I did." "Still, for what it's worth, I think you're incredible. And I think they know they lost something they can't get back." I hugged him briefly. He wasn't the villain in this story, just another character shaped by the same flawed authors. I drove away at dawn, didn't look back at the house, didn't feel anything except a profound, settling calm. The rear-view mirror showed the only home I'd known growing up, but it had never really been home. Home was something I was driving toward, not away from. College was freedom in its purest form. Without the weight of being unseen, I could actually exist at full volume. I made friends, real ones, who chose me deliberately, who remembered details about my life, who showed up when they said they would. I excelled in my classes, earned research positions, published papers as an undergraduate. I joined communities, tried new things, discovered parts of myself that had been compressed under the pressure of invisibility. I called home occasionally, perfunctory check-ins that felt obligatory. Mum would ask surface questions, I'd give surface answers. Dad would tell me about Damien's job search, his apartment, his girlfriend. I'd listen politely and contribute nothing of substance. They never asked the deeper questions. Was I happy? Had I made friends? What was I learning about myself? What had changed me? They didn't know how to access that level of intimacy with me, and I no longer wanted to teach them. In sophomore year, they visited New York once. We met for brunch in a restaurant near campus. They took photos for Instagram, asked me to smile, posted captions about family time. We talked about weather and city traffic, and Damien's recent promotion. The meal lasted 2 hours, and I don't think we had a single authentic conversation. When they left, I felt relieved. By junior year, the calls became less frequent. The initial guilt or novelty or whatever had motivated their interest had faded back into the comfortable pattern of neglect. I was relieved. The distance was honest. Senior year brought honours, accolades, graduate school acceptances, research opportunities I'd only dreamed of. My professors wrote recommendations that called me exceptional, transformative, brilliant. I won a fellowship that would fund my PhD completely. My undergraduate thesis got published in a respected journal. I gave presentations at conferences where people twice my age asked for my insights. I didn't tell my parents any of it. They never asked. Graduation day arrived warm and clear. The ceremony was at Columbia's main campus, 500 students crossing the stage, families cheering from packed bleeways. I stood backstage in my honours regalia, holding my valedictorian speech, feeling calm. They'd assumed they'd be invited. Mum had texted in March asking about dates and ticket information. I'd replied with just the date, May 18th. Nothing more. When she'd called a week before, asking about logistics, I'd delivered the line I'd been preparing for months. I only received 2 guest tickets. I've given them to Professor Williams and Dr. Katz, my research advisors. The silence on the other end had been thick. You're not inviting your family. I'm inviting the people who acted like family. I'd hung up before she could respond, blocked all their numbers for the weekend. I needed this day to be mine, uncontaminated by their performance of parenthood. I actually had 4 tickets. 2 went to my professors. 1 went to Rachel, my roommate and closest friend, who'd been my anchor through every storm. And 1 went to Mrs. Peterson, my 4th grader teacher who'd told an empty chair I was special, and then spent 8 years proving she'd meant it. The ceremony was perfect. When they called my name for valedictorian, the applause felt earned. I walked to the podium and looked out at faces that actually knew me. My speech was about invisible students. about building yourself when no one's watching, about the power of self-creation, about becoming your own foundation. I didn't mention my family once. I didn't need to. We talk a lot about standing on the shoulders of giants, I said near the end, but some of us had to become our own giants. We had to lift ourselves. And maybe that made us stronger. Maybe that made us unbreakable. Maybe that made us free. The standing ovation lasted 90 seconds. Afterward, Professor Williams hugged me tight. "Your parents should be here," she said. "They were never really anywhere," I replied. "But you were." And that meant everything. Mrs. Peterson cried when I handed her a framed photo of us from the ceremony. "You saved me," I told her. "That day you saw me when no one else did. You saved my life." "You saved yourself, sweetheart," she said. I just held up a mirror. I called home 3 days later, after the celebration dinner, with friends, after packing my apartment, after signing the lease for my new place near the graduate program. "Graduation was beautiful," I told Mum. "We should have been there." "Why? You weren't there for the first day of school. You weren't there for any of it. Why would the last day be different?" "We're trying, Helena. We're really trying now." "You're guilty. That's not the same as trying. Trying would have been noticing me when it didn't benefit you, when I wasn't accomplishing something impressive. Trying would have been loving me when I was 6 and ordinary and just needed a parent." Dad got on the line. "What do you want from us?" "Nothing. That's what I've been trying to tell you. I don't want anything anymore. I built everything myself, my education, my achievements, my future, my family. And yes, I mean family. The people who chose to see me, who showed up, who stayed, that's my family now. You're just the people I'm related to." "So we're nothing to you?" His voice was hard. "You're exactly what you chose to be. Distant, peripheral, barely present. I'm just finally being honest about it." I heard Mum crying in the background. "I'll call on holidays," I said. "I'll answer texts. I'll be civil, but I won't pretend anymore. I won't give you the performance you want. I won't let you claim my success as somehow connected to your parenting. I'm done carrying the weight of your guilt." I didn't hang up angry. I hung up free. That was 2 years ago. I'm in graduate school now, thriving in ways that still surprise me. I'm publishing research, building a career, connected to people who see me completely. My parents and I have a surface relationship. Holiday texts, occasional calls about weather. Damien reaches out more often. He's struggling, actually, and I think watching me succeed independently made him realise how much he depended on their scaffolding. I don't gloat, don't punish, don't need to. My victory wasn't destroying them or proving them wrong. My victory was outgrowing the need for their validation entirely. They didn't break me. They forged me. The neglect that should have crushed me taught me self-reliance. The invisibility that should have made me small taught me to build without an audience. I didn't destroy them. I outgrew them. My first day of school, I stood at a door waiting for someone to see me. My graduation day, I stood at a podium where hundreds of people who knew my name looked back. That's not revenge. That's rebirth. And I did it all myself.